Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to roll on with our discussion on the Vietnam War. And with this lecture in particular, we'll begin an analysis of the Vietnam War. But before we begin our lecture proper for today, I would simply like to go back and just do a simple recap on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we looked at the sort of legacy and the sort of end phase of Vietnam. The Tet Offensive and how it largely did not accomplish what a large-scale military offensive would hope to accomplish, and that would be the defeat of their enemy and the driving off of their enemy from disputed territory. The Tet Offensive was largely had the military act a failure for the Viet Cong. It destroyed their infrastructure in South Vietnam, and it destroyed their ability to launch attacks deep into quote unquote safe zones or safe areas in South Vietnam. But it did succeed in destroying the trust between the federal government, the United States government, and the domestic large segments of the local domestic population. It also greatly embarrassed the United States on a global front. Many people began to look at it as the United States may not be the power or the nation that can lead non-communist governments in this struggle, the global struggle, ideological struggle against communism. And with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our discussion. That and a lot of other points that we discussed in the previous lecture will be rehacked again in this analysis of Vietnam. But getting into it, let me just begin again by saying that the Vietnam War was one of the most divisive, internally divisive, and disastrous conflicts in the history of the United States. Now, the reason for the failure in Vietnam is to continue to divide us to this day. Many people blame Lyndon Johnson and his advisors, in particular, for attempting to micromanage the war effort by limiting the offensive capability of the United States military. Others blame the armed forces for pursuing a counterproductive stratagem. And a few even blame the press. And there are also people who view Vietnam as not a failure at all, sticking to the points that Dick Nixon made when he announced that the United States was withdrawing from Vietnam. Now, while these issues raise pertinent concerns, they do not wholly or individually explain or identify the central reasons for the failure in Vietnam. They distract attention from the central reasons that resulted in the mismanagement of Vietnam. The central reasons for the failure in Vietnam lie in political failure and inaccurate public perceptions, both of the nation of Vietnam and of the conflict in Vietnam itself. From the beginning of the United States involvement in Vietnam back in 1950 down to the North Vietnamese capture of Saigon in 1975, the United States viewed Vietnam through the lens of the larger Cold War policy of containment. Now, this stems from the insurgency against French colonial rule lasting from 1945 to 1954. And then the insurgency against South Vietnam, which was led by communist leader Ho Chi Minh. It was also due to the United States' long-term foreign policy aim of rebuilding France to serve as a bulwark against communist expansion in Europe, as a part of the central part of the greater foreign policy of containment. It was deemed acceptable, if not vital, to strengthen the authority of France in her colonial empire. The United States followed the strategy of benevolent neutrality. Sorry about that. Benevolent neutrality in the war against Ho Chi Minh before beginning to shift to a more active support role for the French against Ho Chi Minh from 1950 to 1954. Now, American policy in Indochina really took shape during the tenure of Dean Acheson as Secretary of State. Acheson went on to include the defense of French interests in the Indochine as vital to the American containment perimeter plan in Asia against further communist expansion. And of course, this is all coming about as a result of what happened in Vietnam, what happened in China, and what was occurring at the same time in Korea. It's important to note that during the French War, the French War to reestablish themselves over Vietnam, the United States is fighting, taking on the bulk of the fighting during the Korean War. Now during this time, during the outbreak of the Korean War, the United States was not able to send men into fight, but they did decide to reinforce France with open aid in terms of military supplies and money. By 1954, the United States was financing about 70% of the French war effort in Vietnam. Now, the French war effort to reimpose colonial power in Vietnam ended in utter failure. The failure of the French was made explicit by the communist capture of Bien Ben Phu, sorry. Sorry for the mispronunciation. In 1954, and the subsequent French decision to initiate peace talks with the Vietnamese rebels. The result of this was the Geneva Conference of 1954, which heralded the removal of the French forces and French colonial administrators from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, like Korea, would be divided into northern and southern spheres. Now, at this point, the United States shifted her support from France, who is no longer a player on the scene, to the Republic of Vietnam, that is South Vietnam, and that is the portion of Vietnam below the 17th parallel, in an effort to contain the communist government in North Vietnam. All American actions from that point forward were directed at defending South Vietnam from communism, and from protecting it from communism, represented by the threat of the military invasion by the North Vietnamese army. Now, these efforts really began in earnest with aid to the South Vietnamese leader Diem, and they continued long after Diem's assassination in 1963 under a series of military strongmen who all seized power from one another in turn. Now, the American effort was at first limited to economic aid and military advisement. But when that failed, the number of military advisors began to increase dramatically. The Kennedy administration, for example, rose when the Kennedy administration came into play in 1961. They found that Eisenhower had raised the number of advisors to about 1,000 men. It was about right at around 9,000 men. In Vietnam, advising the Vietnamese military on how to train and maintain forces in the field, how to lead forces in the field. Kennedy, by the time of Kennedy's death, he had raised that number to nearly 17,000. Johnson began a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam and then sent major United States forces into South Vietnam. By early 1968, the total number of troops stationed in Vietnam was over 500,000. At this point, the war was largely an American war. The fact that those forces had failed to achieve a military victory, and that what was really an on-the-ground situation for Vietnam with a military stalemate, coupled with the intense opposition to the war and a disastrous morale and a disastrous drop in morale back home impeded the United States' ability to direct her global Cold War policy. Now, all of that led Johnson's successor, Nixon, to scale down the American commitment in Vietnam and reach a peace accord, any sticking peace accord that he could make with the North Vietnamese government. Now, simultaneously, Nixon tried to build up the effectiveness of the South Vietnamese army, and this was done at the time. At the same time that Nixon was creating the policy or directing the policy of détente with the Soviet Union. Nixon and his advisors believed that the Soviet Union will be able to hold back North Vietnamese actions while the American forces withdrew and while the United States government built up the South Vietnamese government infrastructure and army. Now, the Soviets did not hold back the North Vietnamese. Vietnamization, the plan that Nixon had for withdrawing American forces and building up South Vietnam, failed, and the North Vietnamese army went out to conquer South Vietnam. Now, the key problem was that the American approach was really just impractical. It really was nonsensical. It was an impractical plan. Looked good on paper, but just disastrous in effect. The South Vietnamese government was never a self-sustaining entity. All of the characteristics, all of the traits that a government needs to stand on its own 2 feet, the South Vietnamese government never had a chance to develop. Indeed, as we've seen, Diem's rule during the early stages, where the foundations of such programs could have been laid, were never laid. Diem never invested that much into the development of a bureaucracy that owed its loyalty, or a countryside that owed its loyalty to this central government. There was no one who stayed in power at the top after Diem was assassinated who stayed in power long enough to cultivate any sort of cult of personality or cultivate any sort of long-lasting political friendships to give his government firm legs to stand on. The Vietnam War was larger and more impactful than any other Cold War proxy war. And to the Vietnamese, it was not a Cold War conflict, nor did it factor into any sort of global posturing between the United States and the Soviet Union. After World War II, there were only 2 major global events to take place. Two major ones. One was the beginning of the Soviet Union-United States Cold War, and the other was the decolonization of Africa and Asia, as local peoples, as indigenous peoples, seized the opportunity to overthrow their colonial masters, the great colonial powers that dominated them. The advent of 2 majorly destructive regional wars in Europe has seriously weakened the ability of the colonial powers to police their colony, to exert any sort of superiority, any sort of military superiority over the colonies. Many of these anti-colonial movements had begun long before World War II ended. And particularly in Vietnam, the anti-colonial movement dated back all the way to the 1880s, not long after formal French annexation. Much like other colonial long-term colonies of the powers of Western Europe, the anti-colonial movements began back before the dawn of the 20th century, during the end phase scramble for colonial possessions. Not long after the formal French annexation, the French, like other colonial powers, had to forcefully suppress rebellions against their rule, but not really against such nationalism or collective determinations that would emerge after World War II. The Vietnamese, in particular, had been fighting Chinese imperialism for over thousands of years. An interesting fact about the Vietnamese and Vietnam in and of itself is that the original homeland of the Vietnamese people is not in Indochina. It's actually in what is now southern China. Before the dawn of the first millennia, back in antiquity, they was driven off their homeland by encroaching Chinese imperialism, and they fled south. They keep fleeing south and fleeing south until they landed in their current homeland. That idea of time and of resistance will play a major factor into later events. Now, after World War I, as President Woodrow Wilson was emphasizing national determination, an ethnic Vietnamese living in Paris named Nguyen Sinh Kong had tried to gain access to Wilson to plead his case for Vietnamese independence. Now, he failed in this effort, partly due to his ignorance of Woodrow Wilson's deeply held racist beliefs, but also because it was not in the United States' interest at that time to see any of the major colonial powers lose their colonies. Woodrow Wilson's plan was to allow Europeans to exercise national or ethnic self-determination in Europe, and to allow the major colonial powers to retain their colonial possessions, of course, with the exception of Germany, to allow the other power to maintain and regain control over their colonial possessions. Now, after this failure in Paris, Kong traveled to Moscow, where he received a warm reception by the recently victorious Bolshevik government, who was more than happy to weaken the capitalist governments. Nguyen Sinh Kong would go on to adopt the name Ho Chi Minh, and he would go on to become a Vietnamese nationalist hero and a major proponent of communism in Southeast Asia. These events, and interpreting these events, would plague American understanding of Ho Chi Minh. During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt made it an explicit talking point to condemn colonization. He was particularly frank about his opinions regarding the French in Indochina, Indochina, which, like the Belgian Congo, exemplify the worst aspects of colonialism, really dehumanizing actions there. In the French Indochina, Ho and his organization worked with the United States Office of Strategic Services, the forebearer to the contemporary CIA, to coordinate guerrilla attacks on the Japanese. Now, the two worked well together, and after the Japanese withdrawal, Ho announced the independence of Vietnam, with words taken directly from the United States Declaration of Independence. We'll break here, and we'll come back, and we'll continue on with our examination, our look at analyzing the Vietnam War. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture. I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.